Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Lil Dudes Insect Academy podcast. Wait, before we get started, I just wanted to say thank you for tuning into this episode of the Lil Dudes Insect Academy podcast and just ask you to please hit the like button below or click the subscribe button if you're watching on YouTube, or follow this podcast if you are listening. That really helps the show out. But also, if you want to help us further, then join our Patreon. We have an awesome community that is growing there. Or if you want to make a one-time donation, we are a nonprofit foundation, so head to our website. Both the Patreon and the website will be linked down below. But without further ado, back to the episode. I'm super stoked to be here because I've got a brand new episode for you guys. And I'm coming to you with my new friend, Ben Knowlton. We met at ESA a couple months ago, and he was talking about a little bit of his work. Ben is a grad student at the University of Kentucky studying scale insects. We're going to talk all about that in a little bit. But he's also the host of another entomology-focused podcast called There Will Be Bugs. So I'm super excited to start this conversation. Ben, go ahead and introduce yourself for us. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks for that introduction, Brandon. So my name is Ben Knowlton. I'm a master's student at the University of Kentucky in the Urban Landscape Ecology Lab. Basically, what we cover are any insects that are living in landscapes managed by humans, whether that be ornamental or horticultural plantings, as well as insects in turf grass. My research isn't really in turf grass, but we're a relatively new lab here at the University of Kentucky. My PI got hired 2 years ago, so currently we have 2 graduate students in the lab, and we're looking to kind of expand into the turf realm. Landscape ecology, the urban landscape ecology started off as kind of like managing just pest insects. That's really like historically what urban landscape ecology looked like. But we're seeing that it's evolving more into the conservation of beneficial insects as well, such as decomposers, predators, parasitoids, pollinators, and even like the benign insects that just exist in our landscape. So it traditionally is just, how do I kill this bug that's feeding on my tree? But now we're kind of seeing this evolution of this discipline into not only like managing the pests that we have, because we have plenty of pests in our landscape, but how do we also preserve the other insects in our landscape? So I really like where this discipline is going, and I'm really excited that I kind of landed up here.
Yeah, man, that's awesome. So lots of things going on. I want to break this down a little bit for our listeners. So let's start with landscape ecology. What is that, and like, why is it important to you, and like, what got you into that originally?
Yeah, absolutely. So landscape ecology is like this very broad term. If you
Right.
try it, there's probably hundreds of definitions for ecology out there. And throwing in this urban part is kind of tricky too, because in my research specifically, it's really hard to define what is urban. So urban, the way I kind of put it, is like any landscape that humans are actively managing, whether it be a yard, whether it be their backyard where they might have trees that they planted, or ornamental shrubs or anything like that. That is like urban landscape to me. Anything that like humans kind of have their fingers on, that there's also dwellings involved too. That's kind of what I define as like urban landscape. And then ecology is like the interactions between everything in that community with each other. So you have not only like the plants that are there, you have the insects that are on those plants, you have insects that are feeding on those insects, you have other organisms such as birds or mammals, or some of the larger megafauna on those plants feeding on insects. And then but it also incorporates things like environmental stresses. So what's the water like? What's the soil like? Are there pollutants? Are there things like that? So it quickly becomes this really complicated interaction in this environment that we think we have like a hold on. It's something that we quote unquote manage, but it's really hard to have our hands on everything in the environment, and feel like we're actually in control of it. So
Yeah,
um,
yeah. I mean, ecology in general is like such a broad field, and like there's so many things that are so connected, and that's kind of the point, I guess. And I think insect ecology is especially interesting because, um, insects. We know this. Insects affect every single thing. Every living thing ever, right? So it's really interesting to think about, and then the addition of humans, makes it so much more complicated. So, yeah, you were talking about working with a lot of ornamental ecology and stuff like that. What has been like your experience with that so far?
Yeah, so to kind of give you a little background about myself, I didn't start out as an insect person. When I
Mm,
first went to college, way back when, I went thinking I wanted to be a plant person. I grew up being a plant person. I really enjoyed plants. I liked landscapes and ornamental plantings and things like that. So I got my associate's degree from Finger Lakes Community College, which is a small community college in upstate New York, where I'm from, for environmental studies. I did a lot of kind of hands-on training there, since it's a 2-year school kind of designed for adults who are looking to go right into industry, whether that
mm,
whatever that might be. So I took like a lot of like plant ID courses, forest management courses, uh, field botany, ecology, and like GIS. So really hands-on stuff where you're like going out into the field, you're IDing plants, you're seeing how these plants operate in a forest, you're seeing how they operate in wetlands and things like that. So I was very much a plant person when I
mm,
started out. And after Finger Lakes Community College, I transferred to SUNY ESF, so SUNY Environmental Science and Forestry, which is a public school in Syracuse, New York. And I got my bachelor's degree in environmental biology with a focus in plant science.
mm.
Um, I I chose that degree. That there was a lot of degrees to choose from, but I chose that one because I wanted to. I still didn't really know where I wanted to end up, and I didn't want to kind of pigeonhole myself in one discipline. And environmental biology was like the broadest degree I could take.
Mm.
So I got a lot of advanced gen ed credits, taking things like physics 2, calc 2, cell biology, and genetics. But I also got to focus in topics that I really enjoyed, like plant ecology, wetland ecology, tree pathology, forest ecology, just like these kind of these big idea classes that cover a lot of disciplines, but still kind of had a focus in plants. And then I took a general entomology class as an undergrad, and I fell in love with insects. And I know this is really cliche, but when I took that class, it like changed my life. And I know that's really cliche, but it really
Yeah.
did. I went from loving plants to being like, oh man, insects are so much cooler. They're so much more exciting to me. And from there, I knew I wanted to keep studying insects, but I had this really deep background in plants and plant
Mm.
ecology. So to kind of incorporate the two is kind of how I found myself into insects, more of an insect ecologist than anything.
Yeah. Man, that's interesting. And I think your education on, I mean, it seems like you've had a really broad, robust education, like not just insects, not just plants, like all of biology, really. And I think that's really beneficial, especially for an ecologist. Like I said, because everything's so connected, right? So, man, that's really interesting. So, you took a general entomology course, and that like changed your whole perspective. Do you remember like if there was one like if there was like a moment, or if it was just a gradual indoctrination kind of like, how did that go for you?
Yeah, I think it really came down to the lab portion of that class. So that lab was really taxonomy focused. So like you're
Hmm.
sitting in the lab, you're looking at specimens, and you're trying to ID them and key them out. So it wasn't as intense as like a grad level taxonomy course, but
Yeah.
I think we had to learn like 100 families or be responsible for 100 families like site ID. And just like the amount, I don't think I ever worked harder in a class than I did that lab, where it's like I had a huge stack of index cards that I was studying for the final, and like just looking at these specimens in the lab, when you really take an insect and you put it under a scope and you look at it,
Yep.
and you just see just like they're so intricate, and they have so many beautiful structures and colors, and like it's just amazing. For people who haven't taken a taxonomy course, just looking at an insect under a microscope and like seeing all these amazing structures that they have, I think it's just essentially really beautiful. And that was like the big changer for me. It's just like looking at all this diversity within this group of organisms and seeing how different they are, but they're really all just trying to do the same thing. They're all just trying to make it in life but they have just so many different ways that they do it. I think is really quite incredible.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I really think that is a big part of. I mean, and we'll talk about this in a minute as well. But I think bugs are kind of coming back, like with people in general. And I think part of that is because they're so visually striking and different and interesting. So that's why I think like social media and like macro photography, especially, definitely has played a big role in in helping people realize like, oh, bugs are really cool and they look really cool as well. Yeah, so that's a really and then also like a whole nother side of it is looking at it from a perspective of a scientist, right? So like, why do these things look this way? What's the purpose of this structure versus this one, right? Um, so yeah, that's really cool to think about, and I love that you're like full in on bugs. So your work now with scale insects. Tell us a little bit about that. What are you working on, and like, what brought you to scale insects specifically?
Yeah, so I kind of fell into this role a little bit. So after I got my bachelor's degree, I worked as an arborist in the city of Rochester, New York, for 4 years. I started out I needed a job, wanted to make some money, so I started out on the ground, feeding the chipper, raking, cleaning up, doing things like that. And then my boss kind of realized that I had kind of a background in this, and so he started incorporating me into doing consultations for customers. So part of your job as an arborist is a customer calls you, they say they have a problem with this tree, you come, you take a look at it, you diagnose it, so and and you give them recommendations based on the diagnosis.
Hmm.
And so I was doing that for 4 years, and kind of moving myself up the ladder at the company I was working at. And then I did that for 4 years, and it paid well and it was nice, but it wasn't what I wanted to do forever. And I really found myself wanting to go back to school. I wanted to become an educator and hopefully teach at a college level. And so to do that, I really needed at least a master's degree. And when I first got done with my bachelor's degree, I reached out to labs and had no success. So, this was like right post COVID.
Hmm.
So I don't think there was a lot of money for labs. So I kind of understand that. So I worked in industry for a little bit, and then I got that itch again. I wanted to go back to school. So I applied to the University of Kentucky has an online master's program. So I couldn't find any labs that were doing anything in person at the time. So I started in the fall of 2023 at the University of Kentucky in their online program. And then during that semester, two friends of mine who are in academia sent me a job posting for the lab that I'm in currently. My PI, Dr. Caleb Wilson, just got hired here at the University of Kentucky, and he was looking for master's students, and I applied, and I got the job, and it was one of those things, it's kind of one of those things where my PI, Caleb, has a background in doing scale work. He went to NC State in Steve Frank's lab, where they do a lot of landscape ecology, mostly focused on scale insects. And so that's kind of what his background was in. And so that's kind of where this lab started up, is doing scale work. I imagine we're going to evolve away from that more, but it was just a good starting point. It was a good starting point for him because that's what he was familiar with. That's what his background is in. So that's kind of where I started out. And then my lab mate, Zoe, who's the other graduate student in our lab, is also doing scale research. And that's kind of where we started. And I see this kind of same evolution in the project that I'm doing. So my project started out as looking at scale insects. Specifically, I look at the genus Parthenolecanium, which the common name for those are Lecanium scales. There's two prevalent species here in Kentucky, the European fruit Lecanium scale, Parthenolecanium cornei, and the oak Lecanium scale, Parthenolecanium quercifix. And since I had a background in industry, I really wanted to do like applied work. I wanted to do work that I could directly give to industry to help the industry manage scales better. So my work was really is still, but I started out looking at just seeing how scales are distributed in the canopy of trees. And this seems like kind of a simple concept, but it's not something that people have really looked at, and it's something that's really important to industry, because when you're an arborist doing consultations for customers, you can't really see the upper canopy. So if you're looking at scales in the lower canopy, you don't really know if the same infestation is occurring towards the top of the canopy. And right. It seems like such a simple kind of idea, but it's nothing someone quantitatively looked at when in the past. And so part of my research is just looking at how they're distributed in the canopy of landscape trees. Another part of my research is trying to come up with a scouting method that directly relates to the infestations that we see in these trees. So the common method of looking at scales is just pulling twigs down in the lower canopy, looking at them. Are there scales on those twigs? Cool. But how does that actually the numbers that you're seeing when you're pulling down those twigs, how does that actually relate to the total infestation of the tree? So this is another thing where it's like, it's what arborists have been doing for centuries now, but we don't actually know how that quantitatively relates to infestations in trees. And so it's kind of simple research at its roots, where we got to put numbers to these things. We're going out on a limb and making inferences on things that don't actually have the data to support them. And I do believe that the data is going to support what we've been doing for years, but we need to do the research to actually support that. Right. My research also entails looking at some commonly used insecticides for scale insects, specifically Lecanium scale, and seeing how those perform in the field. Again, this is another thing where a lot of insecticides will broadly label their insecticides for quote unquote soft scale insects. And just because it works on one soft scale insect doesn't necessarily mean it will perform well on Lacanium scale. So again, this is just like where I feel like a lot of my research is really just trying to like play catch up work on things that we overlooked, 20, 30 years ago, and actually put quantitative data on these things. So that's kind of like the first half of my research, is really looking at just covering these very applicable in the field research things that will apply directly to industry. And like covering these gaps. And then my second part of my research is now really trying to broaden this to more of an ecological lens. So I'm looking at how scales, specifically Lacanium scales, recruit natural enemies in these trees. So you have a pest insect in a tree. You have this insect that is pretty defenseless in the terms of like they don't move around, they don't really produce nasty chemicals. They do produce a waxy coating on their body that protect them against things. But you imagine that you have this large load of prey items in this tree, in heavily infested trees, and we want to see how these predators and parasitoids, which I'm grouping them in as natural enemies. That's why I mean as natural enemies, as predators and parasitoids. And we're seeing how those respond to increasing scale densities in these trees. And you'd imagine that like as scales increase, you should see an increase in natural enemies. And we do kind of see that, but it doesn't paint the whole picture, because we still have infested trees, like we still have scale infested trees. And so there's got to be some point where the scales can outpace the natural enemies. And we're really trying to like get down to that number. Like at what point are scales really starting to outpace our natural enemies? Because if they didn't, we wouldn't have breakouts of scale infestations. Theoretically, the natural enemies would keep them in check, but there is some point where the natural enemies can't keep those in check. And so we're really trying to find that tipping point in the populations of scales.
Yeah. So why are scale insects like such an issue? Like are these invasive, or are their natural enemies just like not doing well, or like why are they taking over so much?
Yeah, there are a few good theories out there. And again, with ecology, it's really hard to point at one thing and say that's the reason why. But a few theories we have out there. So the Parthenolacanium cornei, the European fruit Lacanium scale, is an introduced scale in the United States. Parthenolacanium corcifix is a native scale in the United States. We do see both of those species being parasitized and preyed on pretty equally. I don't think it's a problem with like a host preference issue. I don't think it's like that we don't have natural enemies that can take care of the European fruit Lacanium scale. A lot of it comes down to, one, scales can reproduce really rapidly, especially in urban environments where it's warmer. So there's been a lot of research especially from NC State, that show that scale insects, when the ambient temperature is warmer, they produce more eggs, they have better reproductive potential, and they have better survivability. They mature quickly, and so they can just reproduce a lot faster in our urban environments. And so that might be part of it, is they might just be simply outpacing the reproductive potential of our natural enemies. Another problem is in urban environments, the host is under greater stress. So they're under greater heat stress, and they're under greater water stress. So as the host is more stressed, it makes them more susceptible to infestations. They're simply not producing the chemicals that they need to naturally fight off these scale infestations. And so the scales just have an easier time feeding on them and reproducing on them. As the tree's stressed, it's got all these other things that it has to worry about, and then add on the scale insects there. It's how we refer to it in arboriculture is called the decline spiral. So trees, when they're under stress, when a tree dies, it's usually due to many factors. So you have these factors that kind of add on to each other that creates this spiral, this spiraling effect, quote unquote spiraling effect. So you have a tree that's in like a crappy environment. It's like planted in a parking lot median. So it's already hot. It's already not getting enough water. And then it makes it easier for scales to get on there or other pests. And then you have the load of the pest, and then that opens it up to other pests or pathogens, and then you have this like spiraling effect of all these things adding on top of each other to cause the tree to decline. So the spiraling effect is probably another reason why scale insects are such a problem in our urban environments. And then there's other research that have shown that, like, due to the warming of our cities, this urban heat island effect, you do have this disjunction between the life history of the natural enemies and the scales. So the scales can produce or can mature a little faster. Their life cycles are a little faster, and so they're disconnected from the life cycle of the natural enemies. So the scale might grow to a point where the natural enemies can't feed on them or infest or lay their eggs in them. And so like it's just a timing issue then at that point, where then the scale gets to this mature stage where it's simply not compatible for the natural enemies. So those are just some of the theories just adding to the complication of ecology. There's I'm sure it's not strictly one of those problems, but all of them kind of playing on each other to make scales a particular problem, especially in our urban environments.
Yeah. So scale insects. Let's excuse me. So scale insects. Let's break that down a little bit. Like, what is a scale insect? Because a lot of people don't even know what they are. They're little. They're like relatively little studied, from my understanding. Break that down for us. What is a scale insect, and why are they so significant and successful?
Yeah. So when I first got this job, I heard from my PI, and he was like, "Hey, you got the job," and I was like, "Cool." Now I have to do my own research on scale insects. So it was one of those things where you learn about it in general, and so if there's a taxonomy portion of it, but it is not to the extent that I needed. So scale insects are in the order Hemiptera. So they're true bugs. They're really weird. They're not what you think of when you think of a traditional insect. And so they are, the best way to describe them is they're like sacs with they're sacs with like a piercing sucking mouth part that they insert into their plant, their host plant, that they suck up the phloem of the host plant, and the phloem being the water containing photosynthase, so sugars and other nutrients. So scale insects most of the time are immobile. Excuse me. Most of the time, scale insects are immobile. You have hard scales and you have soft scales. So hard scales are in the family Diaspididae, and then soft scales are in the family Coccidae. I mostly study soft scale insects, but I am familiar with hard scale insects, and there's a few differences in their biology. But I will talk about them kind of broadly, since this isn't like a very specific, taxonomy course. They will usually overwinter as instars, so immature individuals on the twigs of plants, and then in the springtime, they will usually mature to adults while sitting on that twig. They're usually immobile by the at this point, so they'll overwinter in a spot and they will stay there. In the springtime, they will mature, and then they'll lay eggs, usually underneath them, so underneath the female. The males will mature to an adult with wings. The males will fly. They'll find a female to mate with. The female will lay her eggs underneath her, and then the eggs will hatch in early summer. And the first instars for scales are called crawlers, and they're tiny. They are microscopic. They are really hard, like smaller than a grain of salt sometimes. And these instars will then crawl under the female. They'll find a suitable spot on the host plant. For soft scales, they'll usually crawl to the leaves or the foliage. Hard scales, they'll usually crawl just on the twig to a spot that's suitable, and they'll settle. So they'll sit there and they'll stay there. They'll insert their piercing, sucking mouth part into the plant, and then they'll feed. They'll feed all summer, and they'll start growing. And they'll go through a few instars, and then in the fall, if they're a soft scale and they're on the leaves of the plant, they'll migrate back to the branches. If they're a hard scale, they'll stay on the branch, and at that point, they've usually lost their legs. They'll completely lose their legs, and they'll be stuck there. And then, so in the fall, when the instars or the nymphs get onto the twigs, then they'll settle there on the twigs. They'll lose their legs, and they'll basically glue themselves to the twig. And then they'll overwinter, and then they'll mature in the summer, or the next year's spring, and then they'll lay eggs, and they'll go through the cycle again. So from what I know, all female scales don't produce wings. They'll crawl on the host plant, and then they'll settle, and they won't produce wings. The males will produce wings, and they'll fly, and they'll find a female to mate with, and then they'll die after that. And so, like, when most of the scales you see on twigs are the females, and they literally just look like a little kind of sack or a bump on the twig of the host plant. And they don't look like typical insects. They don't really have like segmentation. They do have like body regions. All insects do, but they don't really. It's
not prominent.
Yes, it's not prominent, and the mouth part is on the underside of their body, so all you're really seeing is just like this sack that looks like it's glued onto the twig. And to like add to this is like scales. So soft scales will produce like a waxy substance on their backs that help protect them from the environment. So they'll like get this waxy coating on them that like is kind of gross, and like there's all different like kinds that different species will produce, and then armored scales will produce like this almost this shell where it's more of a hard test. It's called a test that covers their body, and it's basically this like it is like a protective shell. It's like this armor that they that they produce on their backs that protect them from the environment. And so that makes a lot of their management, again, really hard because as they mature and produce this substance on their back, it protects them against contact insecticides and things like that. So that's kind of what makes them a challenge to control, at least with typical insecticides, is they have this covering on them that protects them, and you have to, if you're doing like a contact insecticide on them, you have to time it so that you're targeting the crawlers for the best efficacy against scale insects.
Yeah, that kind of caught my eye when you were talking about it. The insecticide issue seems interesting to me because from at least what I've learned today, it seems like they would be pretty difficult to effectively treat because they, in their adult form, the females stay in one spot. They only feed like at one spot. What else? They have that waxy or that armor. I don't know. It just seems problematic to me because a lot of the times you will spray, and then insects will move around and they'll feed in multiple areas, and then they'll oftentimes they will absorb a lot of the insecticide through their bodies, and that all three of those things seem difficult to me. So how, like, what's the current strategy, or do you know, like, what seems to be the more effective strategy? Because they're only feeding on one spot. Like, would it be more beneficial to like treat the plant so that they're poisoned by feeding on the plant? Like, I don't know. It seems problematic to me.
Yeah. So there isn't really a good answer right now. So from what I've seen with my research and literature, and kind of getting to the core of integrated pest management. So listeners who aren't familiar with that term, that's a term that I use a lot, integrated pest management. You have all those different levels of control for pest insects. So you have cultural control, you have physical control, then you have biological control, and then at the top you have chemical control. And for scale insects, I really do believe it begins with good cultural control for controlling scale insects, or managing, more appropriately, managing scale insects. So I think that one of the best things you can do for any pest, especially in urban environments, is make sure your host plant is healthy. So as soon as you open that host plant up to unnecessary damage or stress, it makes it that much easier for a pest to then inhabit that tree. So a lot of trees that I see in urban environments and like in landscapes and things like that have some form of damage, whether it be mower damage, whether it be bad pruning, or whether it be it's planted in just a really crappy location. So like in a parking lot median, we call those death strips, where there's a tiny bit of soil and they plop a tree down in there and you expect it to do well. You're already setting that tree up for failure when you put it in these crappy locations, or you hit it with a mower, or you just prune it poorly. As a plant has those damages to it, like it has to allocate resources to that damage. And so think of the whole pool of quote unquote resources a plant has to heal itself. If it's allocating 40% of its resources to heal up this wound, that's 40% resources that it doesn't have to fight off scales. And
Right.
and that's just like easy things that you can do to give the tree that much better of a chance. If you give a little more leeway with the mower and don't hit it, with the mower deck as you're going by. That's just like easy things you can do to not only like help your tree against scale insects, but other pests species. So cultural control, I think I'm a huge proponent of cultural control, planting the right tree in the right location and taking care of it. You know, a lot goes into making landscapes beautiful. A lot more goes into making landscapes beautiful than just putting a plant in the ground. That's the easiest part. Then you got to think about the care of that plant, and you know, before you even put it in the ground, am I putting the right plant in this location? If you know the location is hot, or it has poor drainage, or it has or it doesn't get a lot of water, there's plants that are already evolutionarily adapted to the specific environments, so you should be putting those plants in those environments from the beginning, because they're already going to do better there than X plant that isn't adapted for that. So starting at the base, starting from the ground, putting the right plant in the right location, and then taking care of that. So if it's hot, it's going to need some water. If it's cold and you have a tropical, a plant from the south, probably shouldn't be planting it there. So cultural control, I would say, is a big factor in controlling scales. However, I don't think that's the only factor. I think you could have an ideal plant in an ideal space and still have problems with scale insects. From there, kind of moving up the ladder, if it's a small tree, if we're getting into kind of the physical control of IPM, or an integrated pest management, if you have a small tree and it's a light infestation, there's been research done here at the University of Kentucky where a great way to control scale insects when the plant is small is using like a scrubber pad. So like a sponge or like those dish scrubber pads, and just scrubbing the scale off the twig. So you see some scales on a twig, just take one of the scrubber pads and remove the scale off the twig. You probably won't remove every single scale, even if you are the most meticulous person in the world, but you are still reducing the load on that plant. You're giving more opportunity for the biological control in the environment to attack the remaining scales. It's a lot easier to control low populations than it is high populations. And so physical control, just like scrubbing scales off small plants and removing them that way. That's not entirely applicable if you have a 60-foot oak tree. That isn't like that isn't the that isn't the silver bullet we're looking for. So then moving on to like biological control, there's been research done recently, especially by my PI and his lab at NC State. So increasing the diversity of your plantings and creating more floral resources. And by floral resources, I mean like having more plants around a tree that flower at different times. Really helps boost the biological agents in that environment. So these biological agents usually feed on the floral nectar of plants. That's when they're adults, they need that energy to fly around to do their daily processes. And so if you have these floral resources in an environment along with your scale-infested trees, you help promote more of the natural enemies around those trees. So you're building up that natural enemy population to help control scales. And so just having a diversity of plants and increasing floral resources really helps. Kind of along with that is not planting monocultures, which we really like to do here in the United States, especially in parking lots and in neighborhoods. If you have a neighborhood that is entirely red maples, that is like a prime host for gloomy scale, and you're just giving it a buffet basically. when you
Yeah.
have nothing but the same plant
All
that
their
is
favorite food. Yeah.
yes, and so you're just helping the scale establish when you have nothing but the same host plant in a row, and you're just making it that much easier for it to reproduce and populate these trees. So that kind of goes back into cultural control, but also kind of with biological control, with just like getting more diversity in our environments, and getting different plants in there, breaking up host species. So you're making it that much difficult for scale insects. And then finally, when we get to chemical control for scale insects, there's a lot of products out there for scale insects. There's a lot of contact insecticides, so like foliar sprays and twig sprays that by contact insecticide, I mean the insecticide literally has to contact the insect in order for it to infiltrate that insect and kill it. There's contact insecticides, there's systemic insecticides, so these are insecticides that we inject or apply to the plant directly, and the plant uptakes them, and then it's incorporated into the tissues of the plant, and as the insect feeds on the plant, it theoretically takes up those insecticides and kills it. And there's a lot of those out there too. And from what I found in my research is if you're using a contact insecticide, good efficacy really depends on the timing, which is difficult. So really you want to time your contact insecticides when the insect is at its crawler phase. So that newly emerged first instar, that baby scale as it's moving out into the world, it doesn't have all that those waxy compounds built up on it, and it's a lot more vulnerable to these contact insecticides. And I found good efficacy in my research with contact insecticides when you have really good timing and really good coverage of the insecticide in the tree, which again is really difficult. Timing it, one, you have to make sure you schedule your appointment with a pesticide applicator when those scales are emerging, when those crawlers are emerging, and that's just a logistical nightmare on its own. And then just knowing when they are emerging. Every year is going to be a little bit different with how warm it is that spring. If it's a colder spring, they're going to emerge a little later. If it's a warmer spring, they're going to emerge a little earlier. You have to know what the environment is where you are. So crawlers are going to emerge different time here in Kentucky than they are in Florida. So just knowing that life cycle of the insect, of the pest, is really important when you're using contact insecticides. For things like systemic insecticides, there's been a lot. They theoretically should work really well. When you think about it, it shouldn't matter on timing, because you put that insecticide into the tree, it incorporates it into its tissues. It's usually good for 1 or 2 seasons, depending on the product. But at least with my research and some of the other research I saw, we're just not really seeing good efficacy. We're not seeing a good knockdown of populations, and there hasn't been a lot of research to show whether that comes down to like the scales biology, if they have like a detoxifying mechanism in them, if it's just that product isn't really effective against scales. Systemic insecticides theoretically should be really good, but we're seeing a lot of variability in the research, in the actual research, and I think it's going to take a lot more research and a lot more grad students to really kind of get that process down. So insecticides, they can be really effective if you're using them properly and applying them at the right time of the year. But it comes down to, like, can you get full coverage on the tree? It's really hard on large trees and not really practical. And so if you're using a systemic on a large tree, it's going to be a mixed bag. It might work well, it might not work really well. And so that's why, we should really be emphasizing the other parts of IPM. So that cultural, that physical, and that biological control. I'm not saying that, we should not we shouldn't use pesticides. I still believe they have their place, but we shouldn't rely on them entirely. And I think the research is really backing that up too, where they don't really work that well on their own. You should really be doing other things to supplement your control on scales.
Yeah, and I think those other ones you were talking about, planting your trees in the right location, all those things. I feel like those are more preventative than combative, if that makes sense. Whereas with biological and chemical, it's kind of once you have them, like this is what you should do. So I feel like they're two separate uses, right? Two separate issues you have. One is to kind of prevent it from ever happening, and the other one is to, like, once that cat is out of the bag, this is what you should do in response to it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, exactly. And so, like, cultural control isn't really an option for trees that are already established in our environment. Besides that, we could still take preventative measures to prevent any further damage, but, like, you can't take that 60-foot oak tree and move it somewhere else. Like, that's just not an option. So you're right. They are kind of applied in different settings. And that's what makes a lot of the management difficult. It's like, unless you're starting from scratch, you're starting from a brand new neighborhood that hasn't been planted. If you already have trees that are established and you have trees that have scales, it's not like you can go back and plant something else unless, that tree dies or whatever. But it's not really an option to, like, cut down every tree that was placed in a bad location and start fresh, because that would take so many resources and time, and it's like, it would be counterproductive at that point. There is a purpose in preserving the trees that we have, but also, if a tree does die, we should be doing better next time and putting a tree there that will have a better life and be able to provide us with the enjoyment that we get from trees for a longer time. So, there's two kind of takeaways from that. Is like, okay, if we do lose some trees, we should do better next time to help ourselves out. And trees that we do have that we want to keep, there are different methods that we can take to try and help preserve those and preserve the health of the tree, and keep it there for our enjoyment. So.
Yeah, for sure. Let's go ahead and, like, shift over to a little bit about your podcast. There Will Be Bugs. That's the name of it, right? Tell us a little bit about, like, what your podcast is, why you're excited about it, and sort of your experiences with it so far.
Yeah, so my podcast, There Will Be Bugs, is it's designed as, like, a week, an episode to episode deep dive into some topic in entomology. And we try and cover a variety of topics. So some weeks it's a very specific insect that we might be covering, or it might be a conceptual idea in entomology. It might be something historical in entomology, or it might be like a cultural application of entomology. So it's co-hosted by my partner Zilla Smith. So we've been doing it for over a year now, about a year and a half, and we really just try and cover all things entomology. And I know that that's like a big catch-all, but
you'll never run out. That's for sure.
Yeah, exactly. We really want to showcase, like, getting into entomology. It's really insane how diverse it is. Even within like our department, there's labs in our department where I conceptually can't even understand what they're doing, but I know they're doing something related to entomology. And it's like, so you have like traditional ecologists like me, but you have like molecular people, you have crop people. It's crazy how diverse the catch-all entomology is. And so we try and highlight that in our podcast, just how many different avenues there are in entomology, and how many different things are going on in entomology. And the podcast started as actually a project for my general ento class I took as a graduate student here last in 2023, the fall of 2023. So I had a general ento class that I was taking online, and the professor for the class, Dr. Jen White, she had like the big project for the class was like, it could be like a mini research project, but she was also open to other ideas. Like she really she did a really good job, like diversifying the project and letting students do whatever they wanted within confines. So some people did like pest control TikToks and things like that. Just like, what's a way to showcase entomology or do research in entomology? And like, so I decided I had been throwing the idea of a podcast around for some time up to that. And it was really inspired, no offense, by Dr. John Larson's podcast, The Arthropod. So I was a longtime listener of that, and I really, that was my first taste of an entomological podcast. And I really love podcasts. I listen to them all the time. Like that's what I'm doing if I'm driving, if I'm if I'm in the lab, I still like listening to music, but I really like podcasts because I feel like I'm also getting some education while I'm doing a mundane task or something. And so it kind of stemmed from like wanting more entomological information out there and wanting to get entomology out to the general public. And so that's kind of, I asked her, I was like, hey, can I do a podcast? And so we set, I would do X many episodes, and I would do like a reflection afterwards, and like just do kind of like a write-up afterwards of like what were some of the difficulties and things like that. And so that's how it started. And then we just kind of kept with it. And I really like how, when you first start off a podcast, it's not going to be good. So any listeners out there, if you want to start a podcast, just do it. It's not going to be good.
Not to start.
Not to start. It's there's going to be a learning curve. I didn't know anything about audio editing. So I started just recording on my phone. The audio quality was terrible. It didn't have that great of a flow to it, but you learn. You start to develop those tools. So now I record in Audacity and I edit in Audacity, and like you start to learn all the little tricks and trades of it. And there's a lot of resources out there for podcasters. There's tons of online resources. My friend got me a really good book called I think it's called Your Museum Needs a Podcast. and that was like a good resource. And you really just got to do it and like learn from your episodes, and you start to refine your podcast. So it hopefully turns into something that is very pleasurable. So
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm obviously very passionate about this as well. But it's an interesting thing has been happening, I think, especially in entomology, but kind of in the world in general, I think. And that is that lots of people are starting podcasts. Some better than others, right? But
yes,
I
yep.
think entomology, especially, is just a really exciting thing that's happening because, back in the day, I think I was talking with Jonathan Larson, and he hosts the Arthropod, and he's awesome. He's coming on the show in a couple weeks, but he's a really great guy. But he started the Arthropod when I talked to him. I think he said he just did like a 10-year anniversary. So he's been doing it long before anyone else was. And then it was me in 2019. So it was just of that I know of. Anybody out there, correct me if I'm wrong, but that I know of, it was just him and then me in 2019, and then it was just me and him for the longest time. And then I went to ESA this last year in 2024, and I met two other people, maybe three, that had just started entomology podcasts in the last year and a half. So I think something really exciting is happening, and they're all a little different, right? Um, Jonathan's is him and his co-hosts, and they just talk about a different thing every episode. Mine is more guest focused, so I talk with people about careers in entomology, right? So they're all a little bit geared a little bit differently, and it's just a really cool thing that's happening. And I'm just really excited about where it's going, and that people are as excited about this as I am. So yeah, I'm super excited that you're doing it. It's super fun, and honestly, I learn a ton from talking with people about things that I didn't even know existed before jumping on the call with them, right? Um, so yeah, it's a big learning experience, and I'm sure with you, you're more topic focused, so I'm sure you learn a ton when you're doing research for the episodes. So yeah, I'm super excited about like where this is going. I'm sure you've got a similar experience with that.
Yeah, it's kind of nice being in school because for a few episodes in the past, I've been doing podcast episodes in review for like classes. So I
Mm-hmm.
learned
Mm-hmm.
something, a cool topic in class, and I'll be like, oh, well, I need to study this anyways. Why don't I create a podcast episode from it? So like that's just like, I'm kind of double dipping in my schoolwork where it's like, okay, I need to study for this class anyways. Why don't I do an episode on it and learn the material that way? So that is kind of a nice thing with the podcast is like I'm already doing the research. Why not put it out there for other people as well?
Yeah.
And so that's kind of how I structure the podcast. But I also really like when the Arthropod will do interviews with guests, and then obviously with your podcast, it's very guest focused, and it's nice
Mm-hmm.
hearing just like what other people are doing with their research or their extension or their education, because there's like so many things in entomology where I'm like, I went to ESA and there was like projects where I was like, this is so cool, like you're doing this, like man, like just something that you wouldn't even consider
Yeah.
as a topic in entomology that people are actually researching and doing. So it's really cool. And I agree with you that I think insects are kind of having a moment, and
Mm-hmm.
justifiably so. Like it's been a long time coming, but I kind of a funny story. So I was in Barnes and Noble a few weeks ago with my partner Zilla, and they had a bunch of like insect merch and things like that, and like way
awesome.
more than you would ever see when I was like
Yeah.
a kid, you know. And it's like, you know, it's really cool that like people are starting to recognize that, you know, insects are out there. They're really important. We wouldn't exist without them, and they're
Yeah.
really cool. Like they have all these really cool things that they do, and they're really beautiful, and like they're finally getting that recognition, and yeah, I think they deserve still some more recognition, but I think we're in the right path.
Yeah, and I mean, just going off of what you just said, that's what I'm all about. Like that's what my career is, moving towards, is trying to get bugs out there more. Obviously lions and zebras and all those things you see on the BBC are obviously really cool and really important, but I think the thing that makes bugs even cooler is that they're right there in your backyard. Like you don't have to go to Africa or the Amazon to see those things. Um, so that's part of why I'm so excited because, excuse me, um, people often overlook them, right? So they're right in their backyard, and we just forget that they exist, right? And like you said, we wouldn't even be here if it weren't for bugs. We rely on them for so many things that we don't even think about. So yeah, it's super exciting that people seem to start noticing them. And I was talking with one of my friends the other day, and I was telling him about there seems to be kind of a shift or like a wave in culture. Um, so if you look back into like the 1800s, naturalism was a huge thing, especially in like the UK. Um, so a lot of people were like hobbyist, insect collectors. So a lot of people had um, insect collections that they would curate in their own time as a hobby, and that just isn't really a thing anymore. And it hasn't been for a really long time. But I'm starting to see maybe not insect collecting becoming a thing again, but more so just the appreciation and like especially photography. I think that might be like the newer version of that, where instead of killing and preserving an insect, you will take a photo of it, and it's a similar outcome, right? Whereas you look at those collections from the 1800s, and I mean, man, they're a piece of art, right? Um, like I saw a collection recently that we have at the Florida Museum of Natural History, and it's from the 1800s from this guy in the UK. He was not a career naturalist. He wasn't. It wasn't his job. He didn't work in a museum. It was just his hobby. And this was like the most beautifully curated collection I've ever seen. Um, I mean, it was amazing. So I'm kind of starting to see a shift because there was that in like the 1800s, early 1900s, and then for whatever reason, people just didn't talk about bugs at all or seem to care. And then like now, it seems like they're sort of making a comeback, and I think it's partly due to science communication and social media. Because, like I said, in my opinion, they're very aesthetically appealing, and maybe not appealing to other people, but like definitely aesthetically interesting, right? Um, so yeah, I'm pretty excited about like where this is all going, and I'm super excited that you're doing a podcast and that other people are starting to do that as well. So yeah, what has been like kind of your favorite parts about learning to do this podcast? Has anything been like surprising to you, or um, what's like your favorite thing, and like will you continue to do this, like, or is this like a couple year project for you?
So I do plan on continuing this. I so I really do want to end up in science communication or extension or education. So don't tell my PI this, but I'm not a huge fan of research. Like I enjoy it while I'm doing it, and like I'll put in the work, but I want to end up teaching entomology and ecology to people, whether it be college students, whether it be the general public, whatnot. And so I do want to keep doing this podcast for as long as I can do it and continue it. What I've really enjoyed, so I don't have a huge following. The podcast is still pretty new, and a podcast isn't built overnight. Rome wasn't built in a day.
For sure.
It's just building up those small connections here and there, and then kind of letting that snowball. But I've had, it's been crazy having the diversity of people who have reached out to me about the podcast. So I put a plug at the end of the show, reach out to me if you want stickers or something. I have like stickers that I send to people and give out stickers and things like that. Yeah, it's great.
Out on my water bottle. Yep.
And I've had a person reach out to me from Canada, a few from the States, a guy from Tasmania reached out to me about the podcast.
That's
and
awesome.
And I'm not really doing this for the fame or the publicity or anything like that, but it's still really nice just, when you have someone reach out to you and be like, oh, I know your podcast and like, I enjoy it and things like that. And, I don't want like an email every day, but when I do get that email or that message, it's just really, it's really fulfilling. It's just, you made a difference. You made an impact on someone, no matter how small it is, like you made enough impact on them for them to reach out to you and say something. And like, that is like perfect. Like for me, that's like perfect. I made enough impact on someone that they cared enough to send me a message. They didn't need to like they didn't have to put in a lot of effort, but it's still like the idea of it that they made the choice to reach out to me. And like, to me, that's really fulfilling, because I don't want this podcast to turn into like a sponsored monster. I never want my podcast to turn into my job. For me, it's my hobby, and as soon as it turns into my job, I imagine I won't like it as much. It's something that I enjoy doing. I don't mind having to like pay for stuff out of pocket for my podcast because it's my hobby. And as soon as it turns into like a job where I have to do sponsorships and I have to make sure I have episodes every so weeks, that's when it will become too much for me. So as long as it kind of stays where it's at, and I gain kind of a cult following, I guess, that's kind of where I see the podcast going, where I don't ever want to have ads in it. I don't want people to have to listen to me advertise whatever the next thing is. I just want people to be able to listen, hear about bugs, and then maybe change what they do or look at the world differently because of it.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I mean, that really speaks to like your passion, right? I think a lot of people start podcasts recently, I think, with the idea like, oh, this is the backup, right? I can, once this gets big enough, I'll drop out of school and go full time. And I'm like, if you're doing it for that, you're going to be severely disappointed. And that really takes away from the passion of why you're doing it. I think that's part of why entomology podcasts are so exciting, I think, is because we're all just passionate people that just like to talk about this. I mean, when you were talking about, scale insects and, IPM and all that stuff, it was clear to me that you are just very passionate about your research. So yeah, I really love that you are taking on this podcast, and your research really leverages that education aspect, about educating people, where you should and shouldn't plant certain things, and why those things are important, and what we can do to play our part in keeping these insects here. keeping them going so that we can benefit from them. Obviously, insects are endlessly important to us. We wouldn't survive if it weren't for insects easily. So yeah, it's really really exciting stuff what's happening in the world. But Ben, I'd like to go over like what are your big plans for the future? Like you're in grad school right now, but looking forward like 5 years, maybe 10 years, where do you see yourself going with research or science communication or even the podcast?
Yeah. So to to start that, so I am looking to change my degree over to a PhD. So that is in the
Nice.
works currently. We have funding for it. I really like my PI. I really like it here at the University of Kentucky. So that was kind of like an easy switch for me. We haven't done it officially yet, but that's in the works. And so
That's
when
awesome.
that's all done, I'm really looking to, like I said, I would prefer to be a professor, a lecturer at like a community college level. My
Yeah.
experience at Finger Lakes Community College was amazing.
Oh yeah.
We had a really great department there, and I'm still really good. I guess friends. I can't think of a better word, but like friends with with my advisor there, and then my one of the other professors there, multiple professors there. But I still have like that really good connection with there because it was like a small, close knit community. Our class size was no bigger than 30. Even that, maybe even 20. Like 20 might even been like.
I had a similar experience at a community college as well. Um, Obviously, it's really good for students because as a student, you can save a lot of money by
Yeah.
going, starting your degree there. That's what I did, and it's also beneficial for a lot of students because you have that smaller class size. You can actually get to know your professor, especially if you're in a larger discipline like biology or the humanities. Those classes are often really really big um, if you're at a university like engineering as well. Um, if you're at a university, those classes are super big, and you don't even get to know your professors. But if you're at a community college, you get the same quality of education with a much smaller class. So yeah, I love that. That's really cool.
Yeah, and also like I don't think the community college I think in the past has kind of gotten a bad rap, but like I don't think it's justified. Like the professors
Hmm.
I've had at community college, a lot of them were better at teaching than the ones I had at ESF. No offense to them, I'm not trying to like bash anyone here, but like they're there. You don't make a lot of money at a community college comparatively, but like they're there because they enjoy teaching, and you
Hmm.
can really get that from them. Where I've had professors before at larger institutions where like research is their main thing, and so they might not be the best professor, like the best lecturer, and so I think that like makes a huge difference on people's experience in college. Is like you might be the best researcher in the world, but like if you can't get that information to your students and they're just not engaged with the class, like you're not going to remember it, you're not going to care as the student, and like that's how you get people into that discipline or into science. Is like you need to engage them first and get them like excited about it. Just showing them like your awards and your great research isn't going to do that. You need to be able to talk with them and get them excited about it too. And so that's why I really want to be I want to be a teacher at a lower level, or an extension where I'm engaging directly with the public. And
Hmm.
so you can do the same thing with the public and try and try and convey the information to them in a way that they can, in a way that makes sense to them. The public, I'm not saying, a lot of people in the public are really smart, but like you give them something like a science paper that's written in a very specific way, it's kind of, it gets lost in the translation. And sometimes people just need a little help understanding it in terms that they can understand. And so I think that's really important, because like the public is also just as important in insect conservation and everything that we're doing. You got to get them on board too. You know, you can't just have the ivory tower in one column and then the public in another column. If they don't interact, nothing's going to happen. So getting them on board as well is how we get things moving forward. And sometimes you just need someone to explain it to them a little better.
Yeah. Oh man, that's really cool, and I love that you're looking at doing that, and it's a really important thing to try and give those students just as good opportunities and education as those that go to university. Yeah, that's really cool. And possibly moving into your PhD, are you thinking to just extend your scale insect research, or maybe shifting a little bit, or like what's your thought about that?
Yeah, so we've been kind of working on my proposal, me and my my PI, and it's gonna be still kind of scale based. We're incorporating some other species of scale, so gloomy scale and calico scale, and we're doing some different work with them to see how specific tree cultivars, so different red maple cultivars, influence the growth rate and fecundity of those scales, and seeing if there's better options. If you have to choose, if you're gonna plant red maples, if there's a better option of cultivars to plant that might help slow the progress of gloomy and calico scale. And then we're also looking at how we have a bunch of trees that we planted at one of our research farms last year that are uninfested. So we have like a blank slate, a brand new slate. We're going to infest them with the scales and see kind of what natural enemies are first on scene when you have a new infestation of scales. So what's coming into these trees after they get infested with scales, like really off the bat. And this is kind of cool research, because a lot of scale work is done with trees that are already infested in the environment. So a lot of times people are already looking at trees that are infested. And so we kind of have a cool opportunity where these trees aren't infested. We're going to infest them, and we can kind of watch it from, day one and see kind of what happens over time. And I imagine that these trees are going to be a great resource, not only for me, but other grad students down the road, because we'll be able to watch these trees from day one to, year 10 and kind of see how the environment in that tree changes as scales build up populations and things like that. So it'll be cool. It'll be a cool resource to kind of get this longitudinal survey on what's going on in these trees.
Right, yeah, and that's really important to get like an idea of how, I mean, like you were saying, a lot of your research is like laying the bedrock of scale insect knowledge, right? Which is really exciting, I think, because the fact that we don't already know things like that is kind of crazy, especially considering how much of a pest scale insects are. So yeah, really, really cool stuff. Also looking ahead to the future, are there any like cool trips or places you want to go or anything like that? Just like personally, or maybe even for research?
Yeah, it's kind of hard as a grad student. We don't make a ton of money, and your schedule's pretty busy. But one of my favorite places to visit is the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. And that's, West Virginia is just the state over from Kentucky. It's not too far of a drive. If you've never been there, it is, it's like it's like a blanket of green forest. It's not very populated. It's as they say, it's wild and wonderful in West Virginia.
Yeah.
I really love it there, and I'm really hoping this summer to take some trips out there and do some light trapping. So some light trapping at night in those just vast forests where there's not really any light pollution around, and kind of hopefully see some really cool insects. So I think that is like an achievable trip to do this summer, where it's not too far, it's not too expensive, because me and my my partner camp, so we can get a campsite, save some money that way, and just be out in the woods and in this beautiful place. If you ever have a chance to go to the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia, it's incredible. I really love it there. So.
Man, what more could you want than that? Like that sounds awesome though.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah. So, how about like personally to get away from school or research, or like what are some other like activities or hobbies that you enjoy in your spare time?
Yeah. I know this is gonna sound like I'm not getting away from work, but I really I have my own insect collection that I'm curating. I really love pinning insects. I think it's really relaxing and like therapeutic, just sitting down and pinning insects. A lot of people think it's very kind of tedious, and I can understand that, but I really I like and I like being a perfectionist with it. The pin perfect, get the legs perfectly placed, get the wings perfect, and like I really like curating insects in my collection. I also really like so I've rode motorcycles ever since I had a license,
Nice.
when I was 17 years old. So I like riding motorcycles. Kentucky around Lexington's a beautiful place to ride motorcycles. There's so many just back roads that are barely 2 lanes that you can just get lost on,
That's awesome.
lost in a good way. I usually just like will throw my gear on, hop on the bike, and just go. There's no destination. I'll just like, oh, this seems like a cool road to turn down, and just see where it takes me. And I've experienced a lot of really cool backroads in Kentucky doing that, just hopping on the motorcycle and just getting lost for a few hours on the weekend.
Man, that's awesome. Yeah, Ben, this was a awesome talk. I mean, awesome to get to know you better, together, and I mean, really, really cool stuff you're working on. I love that you're working on the podcast too. It's really exciting, to see that other people are as stoked about bugs as I am, and that we're taking that to the internet. So I think it's a really cool place to introduce people to things they might not think about, right? Maybe change some stigma around bugs, and that they are actually really cool, and that they are super important as well.
Yeah, so one thing I kind of want to piggyback off of what you said earlier in the episode, that like
Yeah.
insects are often overlooked. They're right under our noses, and something that I really kind of embraced in my research, or like became exposed to, is like the amount of cool insects just in mundane places around you. You don't have to travel to these far off lands to see these cool insects. You can go right into your backyard and look into the tree and see these really amazing cool insects. They might not be huge and like these massive insects you see on Instagram, but there's still really beautiful insects just in your backyard. You just got to look for them a little bit. And I think that's also kind of the enjoyment in it, is like they're kind of hidden. They're kind of this secret, this little secret in nature. And if you put a little bit of time into looking for them, trust me, you'll find them. You might not find them right at first, but put some time in. Go outside and sit down in the grass and look at things, and you'll see really cool insects. So I think that's like one of my favorite things about insects is like they're right there. We don't have to go very far to see them.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a really great point, and um, yeah, I think it's really important to. I mean, I've said this a million times on the podcast before in other episodes, but it's really important to try and appreciate them and also respect them, right, for what they do for us and like so many things. I mean, human health, um, agriculture, our food supply, like all of these things are tightly influenced by insects in so many ways. Um, so like pollination, right? Ecology, all those things are so affected by insects. It's astounding to me that we don't think about it, right? Because they're so small and kind of unassuming. So yeah, it's really cool stuff. But um, yeah, Ben, I'm gonna leave your links as well down in the description for you guys to go check him out and his podcast out as well. Um, so you guys can follow along there and um, check that podcast out. And Ben, thanks again so much for being on the show. This was, like I said a minute ago, super fun. So yeah, thanks for taking the time to chat with me.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Brandon. It was such a pleasure.
Sweet, awesome. Well, thanks again. Yeah, thank you guys for listening, and um, that was a great episode. Thank you so much.